explaining adaptations. Adaptations, first of all, we need to know exactly what that word is, what adaptations are. Adaptations are not a verb. We're not talking about to adapt. We're talking about a noun. We're talking about inherited features that help an organism survive in their environment. This isn't good enough for a definition, but down the road, when you understand what it means, we can call adaptations as beneficial traits. Whatever helps an organism be fit. And we'll come back to explaining what I mean by this last bullet point, but think about this picture. Do you see any adaptations? Think about this little rodent here, and what's the most noticeable adaptation? The whiteness of its fur. And in this background, it's going to absolutely help it survive. It's going to give it a leg up. It's going to give it an advantage. It's going to give it a benefit of having white fur, just to blend in with its surroundings. Going forward, we have to differentiate between these two terms, inherited versus acquired traits. So you want to make sure that you get these definitions. We're going to talk about them over and over and over again. Heritable and inherited essentially mean the same thing. We're talking about genetics, and we're talking about inheritance from parents to offspring, characteristics that can actually be passed on, as opposed to acquired characteristics, characteristics that an organism can get at any time during their lifetime. But the distinction is that acquired characteristics are absolutely not able to be passed on. Think about your own set of pierced ears, if you have them. Can you pass on ear piercing to your offspring? So in the next couple of slides, we just want to take a look at the picture, and whatever jumps out at you, whatever kind of characteristic is the focal point of the picture, you can just answer to yourself, is it acquired or an inherited characteristic? So this first one, we're looking at a Venus flytrap here, is the common name for this organism, and the fact that, or the characteristic that this plant can actually trap small insects and essentially digest them to obtain nutrients that they need, is that an inherited or an acquired characteristic? Inherited or acquired characteristic? Inherited or acquired? Opposable thumbs, inherited or acquired? Coloration pattern, inherited or acquired? Inherited, oh, this is an old college picture, back when I was bulked up a little bit. Inherited or acquired? Could this characteristic be passed on from parent to offspring? In my opinion, thankfully, but it is definitely acquired. Speaking of acquired characteristics, this guy right here, whose name was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, Lamarck suggested a long time ago that body parts, and he specifically was thinking about animals, but body parts that were actually used were going to become larger and more apparent, and those that aren't used as much would be deteriorated. So he talked about the concept of use and disuse. So he explained a giraffe's long neck by one individual of the family tree stretching up to get more leaves, and the next generation more leaves and more stretching, and eventually a giraffe acquired a longer neck over generations. So 150 years ago, this idea was widely accepted. It just made sense. It was to the best of our knowledge, it was accepted. So although we know, just like you can't pass on a tattoo or pierced ears, a giraffe can't stretch out its neck, physically make the decision to stretch out its neck to reach more leaves and then pass on longer next to its offspring. But he did emphasize this importance that we've already seen in lab: adaptation to the environment. Although we know that acquired characteristics cannot be passed on from one generation to the next, we do know that there are a lot of characteristics that can be passed on. But through the use of artificial selection, humans can actually choose the individuals, the parents that are going to reproduce based on certain traits that'll hopefully give them certain outcomes. And there's tons of examples of this. This is exactly what dog breeding is all about. Taking parents, a female dog and a male dog, and getting the best characteristics and having them interbreed so that their offspring are likely to have those same characteristics. That's what racehorses are all about. That's what all of agriculture is about, from producing beef cattle to producing vegetables and fruits to producing disease-resistant crops, drought-resistant crops. All of that comes about by humans choosing the parents and getting the crosses that they so desire. So there's no doubt that artificial selection occurs. It occurs in agriculture, breeding of domesticated animals and agricultural animals, from beef to milk and dairy cattle, to horse breeders, from all sorts of examples here. But the question is, how does that compare to what would maybe happen in nature? If artificial selection occurs, what about natural selection? Charlie Darwin, which I call him, I'm on a first name basis with this dude. Charles Darwin was really the first individual that proposed the idea of selection forces taking place in nature, or natural selection. Remember, artificial selection means that human beings make the selective forces. Like, hey, this is going to breed with this. But he first proposed this occurring in nature. Notice that I refrained from actually calling Darwin a scientist. With his upbringing, what he was basically a naturalist. He was a naturalist. I mean, this guy would have been a Cabela's or REI freak, probably. He got on a ship and he sailed around the world enjoying nature. And he got he gets a bad rap to this day for his ideas. And I don't even know if he would trade all that in for kind of a little bit more of a normalized idea of him after the fact. But a lot of people paint him as some anti-religious individual, and they don't even know. They don't even do any background checking to look at this guy. He almost became a priest, actually, in his upbringing. But anyway, back to the science. Charles Darwin is synonymous with the idea of natural selection and probably evolution, even though he never used the term. He called his ideas descent with modification. So really, here we go. Here's some basic bullet points or main ideas of natural selection. We've already established this in the lab. We know that more offspring are born in populations than can survive. We also know that the organisms or the population will reproduce and grow rapidly if there are no limits to the population. However, we also looked at variation. Variation occurs naturally in populations. Individuals within a population vary greatly from one organism to the next. Not all babies are the same. Not all ladybugs are the same. Coloration patterns of giraffes are not the same. Remember our seed variation lab. We empirically showed that individual characteristics, like something as simple as the length of a seed, can vary greatly from one individual to the next. An important characteristic of that variation is that it is due to genetics. Remember that. We established that in class. That most variation is inheritable. In other words, that it can be passed on from parents to offspring. The coloration patterns come from parents. Mostly the length of the seeds that we measured in lab, that's due to the genetics of the parent plants that passed on those characteristics. When we look at populations, we also notice that the population size will remain fairly constant over time. Why? Because there's a lot of things acting on that population to keep the actual number in check. All these rolled into one, and the fact that we know that environmental resources that organisms need, they are limited. There simply isn't enough resources, to keep it simple, like food and water and space and available mates for reproducing. It isn't unlimited. There's only room or enough food or enough water, enough mates for only a partial percentage of the population. Therefore, there must be a struggle to survive within populations, which will result in only part of the population surviving. To put it really simple and blunt, in each population, whether it's a population of bighorn sheep or golden eagles or whatever it is in nature, there are winners and there are losers. The winners survive, the losers die off. Before I even do any summarization of this screen, I want you to know that these 3 bullet points are hugely important, and you want to make sure that you understand each one of those. These are conclusions of the information that we have about populations. The result of this struggle, remember the competition to survive, depends at least in part on the characteristics that an organism has. And remember, those characteristics are inherited from their offspring or from their parents. Another conclusion is that individuals whose characteristics best gave them a fit to survive in the first place are more likely to survive and leave more offspring than the less fit individuals. In other words, organisms whose variations or variations on the traits gave them a better chance to survive, well, they're going to pass on those same traits that helped them survive in the first place. And remember from our variation lab, like when we hypothetically thought, well, what if only the longer seeds reproduced and we planted them and let them grow? There's going to be a shift. This unequal ability of individuals to survive can lead to gradual change in a population. So whatever conditions are actually selecting for certain traits, whatever traits give an individual a better chance at surviving are more likely going to help them survive and be passed on then to the next generation. It's important, extremely important, to know that we're talking about science, nothing beyond science. And science is talking about the evolution of populations. Never that some individual is going to change over the course of their lifetime, or wake up one day, or all of a sudden be born with feathers, or all of a sudden be hatched and have super eyesight. It's not about individuals changing from one generation to the next. It's simply about a shift in the overall characteristics within a population. That is evolution. So again, you'd want to go back, make sure that you go back through this screencast and you pay attention to what we said about populations. There's a struggle to survive. There's going to be winners, and those winners have whatever characteristics, remember we call those adaptations, whatever characteristics they have that help them survive in the first place are then going to be passed on to offspring. This is very rough and very generalistic, but if something dies off, its characteristics aren't going to be passed on. Those dead raccoons on the side of the road are done reproducing. In other words, they're not going to pass their genes on anymore. They've died off. Only the survivors get to reproduce and pass on their genes. And what that can cause is actual shifts in the characteristics that are found within a population.